Oh, hi there. So we're going to be doing lecture Factor Markets 2, which in the first lecture I told you that we would come back to this question of how much of one unit of one input to employ. That's really what we're going to be looking at here. So it's relatively straightforward. It's the same kind of idea of like profit maximization, where you produce at the quantity where MR equals MC. For a firm, they hire up to the quantity of workers or machines or whatever, where the additional cost of that machine equals the additional revenue generated by that machine. Or if you're talking about a worker, they hire up to the point where the cost of that worker is equal to the revenue that that worker generates. So they continue to hire, they continue to employ until they get to that point. So that's a pretty straightforward idea. I did make a couple of little boo-boos in this. The first one is right here. It says TC, that should say TR. So right off the bat, we're just going to be like, here's where I screwed up. And then I didn't include two phrases, but I think I'm gonna mention them to you. This is also sometimes called the profit maximizing quantity of an input. And there are two things you have to know. One is marginal revenue product, which we established in the first lecture is the marginal product of the worker or the machine or whatever times the price of the output, right? So it's like, if you're a hamburger flipper at Mickey D's and you can flip 10 hamburgers an hour, right? That's your marginal product times the $3 that those hamburgers generate for the company, then your marginal revenue product is $30 because it's the 10 that you produce times what they sell for. So it's the additional revenue that the company gets from employing an additional unit of a factor. In a real sense, it's the actual demand curve for an input for a firm. Like the firm's demand for workers is based on their marginal revenue product. The second thing is the marginal factor cost. And this is the idea of like the supply curve of an input for a firm. And this is sometimes called the marginal resource cost or MRC because factors and resources are the same word. It's the additional cost of employing an additional unit of a factor. And so in a perfectly competitive labor market or factor market of any kind, it's the same because the firm is so small, it has to just take the wage or it takes the cost of whatever the machines are from the broader market. So the market would set the wage and then the firm is like, okay, that's how much we have to pay our workers. So it doesn't matter how many workers they hire. The first one might be $10 an hour. The second one's $10 an hour. The third one's $10 an hour. And they hire up to the point where the MRP equals the MFC or the last worker before which the cost of the worker exceeds the revenue that they generate for the company. So two graphs side by side. And this is actually the same picture we drew once already, but it's good to get in the habit of drawing it, right? You've got demand for labor, quantity of labor, wage, supply of labor. So this is the market, the labor market, perfectly competitive labor market. Thousands and thousands of sellers and buyers of labor. And that's the quantity in the market, and that's the equilibrium wage. And then from the firm's perspective, they have like the quantity of labor that the firm's going to hire and the wage and all that stuff. And for them, they hire the first worker. Well, what do they have to pay them? The equilibrium wage. They hire the second worker. What do they have to pay them? Well, they got to pay them the equilibrium wage and so forth. And we talked a little bit about this in the first lecture, but basically every single additional worker costs the company the same amount. They hire the worker for $10 an hour, then the marginal factor cost is 10. So the MFC is going to remain constant for these because it doesn't matter how many workers they hire, they have to pay them the same wage rate that's derived from the market. Now, from the firm's perspective, the first worker generates lots of marginal product, right? A whole lot. And we would say, whole bunch, way up here. So for them, they're going to generate a lot. That's the marginal product times the price. The second worker might be even more. Then the third worker falls, and it starts to fall down lower and lower. And if we kind of connect these dots, right, this is the MRP, which is just the marginal product of each worker times the price. Now, why does it behave this way? Well, the first worker generates a lot because they're the very first worker that you hire. The second one gets a little bit more because they start to specialize, right? Specialization of labor. And the third one a little bit less than the second one because they're starting to get diminishing marginal returns. So this concept that we learned back in Unit 3 is coming back again. And in fact, this whole graph is just an inverted picture of what actually the other graphs look like. It's just inverted along the x-axis. It's mirrored. right? Because this is just the mirror image of a marginal cost curve. So they would hire up to the point where the MRP equals the MFC. So they would hire this worker, yes, but not that worker. Because for this last worker, whichever one that one is, that worker's revenue that they bring to the company is less than it would cost to hire them, so they're not going to hire them. Now, let's take a look at what a minimum wage would look like in this situation. And I'm going to be very clear here that, in fact, this situation, the perfectly competitive labor market, it would be just as unusual to see in the real world as a perfectly competitive market. We don't see very many actual perfectly competitive markets. We don't see very many perfectly competitive factor markets either. But this is often used to teach introductory economics students why the minimum wage causes unemployment. And there is a problem with using it, right? It would be the same problem as saying all the markets in the entire United States look exactly like perfect competition. Well, we know they don't. We know they don't. There's oligopolies, there's monopolies, and all this other stuff. So I'm telling you all of this before I show you this, because this is one of the most common things that students leave economics with, is thinking, oh, minimum wages have to cause unemployment. It's just a fact. Well, yeah, if you use this model, right? But understand there's some very important assumptions that this model makes that aren't necessarily always true in the real world. And we're going to actually look at that in lecture 3. So we're going to start by redrawing the same graph that we just had: wage, quantity, quantity, wage, demand, supply, and then we have QM and an equilibrium wage. And that goes across and makes the MFC, and we'll just go like that. That can be our MRP. We don't need that little hooky do. That's not actually important. You can just go down this little bit. So we know that the firm initially is going to hire QF because that's where MRP and MFC are. We know that the market's going to hire QM, and that's some huge number of workers. And the government comes along and says minimum wage time. Well, a minimum wage is a price floor. That means you can't go to WE. The price is going to stop before it gets there. So it's going to be here. So we have W min. And all that really is taking whatever WE is and like adding some value to it to make kind of this new line. It goes straight across over to here. This is our minimum wage. It's price floor. And so what all it does is just causes there to be a lower quantity demanded in the market. So this is the new quantity with the minimum wage, because the firms aren't going to want to hire that many workers at W min. There's some level of unemployment because there's a large number who are willing to supply their labor, right? That's the quantity supplied. And so there is some proportion who are unemployed. And in fact, some proportion, this proportion, used to be going from QM to QM to Q min. That portion used to be employed and now lost their jobs. And so you could see how if you use this model, you would say immediately like, well, minimum wage bad, right? Because you literally caused people to lose their jobs in order to give some people a higher wage. And from the firm's perspective, they look at it and they go, well, if I have to pay this wage, then that's my new MFC. That's my new marginal factor cost. So I'm going to look at where MRP and MFC are, and that's the new quantity. And so every firm hires a few fewer workers, they lay off a couple of people, and that's what they're faced with. Now, that's a little bit untrue in the real world, sometimes, asterisk, right? Now we're going to do one last one. This is going to show an increase in demand for the product in the market of the firm. Your book actually has a good example of like what it would look like if there's a change in the supply curve of labor. And it kind of behaves basically in a similar fashion to what you would see up here. It just changes where the new MFC is. So like if the supply curve shifts to the right, then there's a new equilibrium here, and you know, more workers get hired and all that. But there's at a lower wage because there's more workers. So the supply curve is fairly easy to model, and you could probably suss that one out on your own. I'm going to show you the increase in demand though. So we're going to start from the equilibrium. Quantity, wage, demand, and supply. And we have WE, quantity in the market. And that's what sets the MFC. Unfortunately, we don't have a Mr. DARP for this one. It just kind of is what it is. So, and then that's the marginal revenue product. Now, For this one, this is kind of scary. So I don't be scared. Don't be scared. You're going to be okay. You're going to be all right. So there's an increase in demand. So as soon as that happens, right, a couple of things happen. Q1, more workers are going to get hired in the market, and they're going to get paid a higher wage. So that's going to mean the MFC will be higher. The MFC would be higher because this MFC just comes from whatever the wage is. So that's definitely going to happen. And I think that my numbers in this picture don't necessarily match up here, but that's fine. And we used to be, just to be clear, we were at QF. But the firm isn't going to hire fewer workers, right? Because in fact, what's really happening is that with an increase in demand for workers, that means that this MRP is going to shift to the right. The only reason that this demand curve ever moves is if all of the underlying demand curves also moved. So literally, like, this D1 shift had to have been accompanied by an MRP shift here. And that's what the demand curve moving does. In fact, this D1 curve and this D curve are just the summation. It's a Riemann sum of all the functions of these. And so that's actually all it is. It's just a sum of all the MRPs added together. So if this one's shifting to the right, then this one also has to be. So we're going to go from this point to this point, right? And that's not like terribly scary if you really think about it. It's literally just moving in the exact same way, right, up and to the right that we saw, for the market. So, so hopefully that one's not as scary, even though at first glance it might seem really scary. The firm hires more workers, they get paid more. So hopefully this helped you. See you next time.